Love in the Wild West always comes unexpectedly, like the twists and turns of the Red Desert. If you want to listen to all the fiery love stories under the sunset of the Wild West with me, please subscribe now. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I will send you a secret love story that no one has ever heard before. The town lay hushed in the late afternoon, a thin veil of dust drifting down its single street. Beyond the saloon and the sheriff's office, the land stretched empty and pale under the weight of the Sunday. At the far edge, where the fences of Elias Carver's ranch leaned tiredly against the wind, movement stirred along the flats. 5 figures emerged, their steps uneven but determined. They were young women, Apache by their bearing and features, their dresses torn by thorns and travel, their bodies marked by wounds that had half-healed but not forgotten pain. Hunger had narrowed their faces, yet their eyes held a fierce steadiness that defied pity. Elias was by the corral, hammer in hand, a bent nail clamped between his teeth. 30 years of silence and wandering had made him wary of strangers. When he looked up, his body tightened, ready to turn away. He had lived here for 2 years to avoid trouble, not invite it. But the sight before him froze him in place. The women stopped at the gate, the last boards patched with scraps of old wood. They stood together, shoulders squared despite exhaustion, and for a moment he thought he saw ghosts from his youth. Long ago, by a creek, he had shared bread with girls who came to play without shame. Faces in memory, half lost to time and fire, now returned as flesh and blood. One of the women stepped forward, her voice steady, despite the tremor that edged her words. "Don't you recognize us, cowboy?" she asked. "We were the ones who played here with you, before the soldiers came." The hammer slipped from Elias's hand. For a heartbeat, doubt and fear fought inside him. Fear of the town, of the whispers that would follow, of the weight he might not be strong enough to carry again. But the past struck harder than silence. He pulled the nail from his teeth, crossed to the gate, and set his hand on the weathered wood. Without speaking a welcome, he pushed it open wide enough for all 5 to pass. His voice, flat but steady, carried only one word: "Come." Relief and disbelief flickered across their faces. For the first time in weeks, the 5 women felt the ache in their bodies ease. The gate had opened, and with it, perhaps, the chance to live again. The door of Elias Carver's house creaked as he pushed it open. The small cabin was plain, a single table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed pressed against the wall, and shelves lined with jars of beans and dried corn. It was a space built for one man and his silence, not for company, let alone 5 women. They stepped inside hesitantly, their eyes quick to search the corners. Survival had taught them to notice everything: where the tools were stacked, where the windows might offer escape, how much food the shelves could truly hold. Their movements carried the weight of caution, but also the dignity of those who refused to beg. Elias set a plate on the table: cornbread, a heel of bacon, beans left from his own meal. He gave a short nod. "Eat." For a moment none moved, as if uncertain whether the offer would be taken back. Then one of the younger women broke off a piece of cornbread, passed it carefully to the others, and only after they each held something did she taste her share. They ate slowly, sparingly, like those who had lived too long on roots and bitter herbs. While they ate, Elias filled a basin with water, set a folded cloth beside it, and motioned toward their wounds. His silence was not cruelty, it was habit. Words had failed him too many times in life, so now he spoke through action. One woman loosened the cloth at her ribs, revealing a deep gash that had scabbed raggedly. From beneath her dress she drew a pouch with bone needle, sinew thread, and strips of cloth. She intended to mend herself. Elias lifted the lamp closer, holding it steady as her hand shook with the first stitch. "Take it slow," he said quietly, his voice rough but without judgment. The others watched in silence, their faces tight with empathy, until the wound was closed and wrapped firm. Then another came forward, her arm marked by a long scrape. One by one they tended themselves, and Elias remained near, setting water, steadying the light, offering what little he could. When it was done, he poured willow bark into a cup, let it steep, and placed it on the table. The women shared it in turns, each sip easing pain. For a long while the house carried only the sound of spoons against plates and fire popping in the stove. Elias leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his eyes unreadable. Yet inside, his thoughts pressed hard. These women had carried themselves through fire and hunger. Now they were here, under his roof. The town would not forgive it easily. But watching them stitch wounds with steady hands, he knew one truth. He could not send them back into the flats. The silence that filled the house was no longer empty. It was the fragile beginning of belonging. By morning, the ranch no longer felt like the refuge of a solitary man. 5 pairs of footsteps marked the yard. 5 voices murmured quietly as they swept the porch, boiled beans with sage, and mended their torn dresses with coarse stitches. For Elias, the sight was strange, unsettling, yet not unwelcome. But the town noticed. It began with the storekeeper's boy, who passed the ranch with a sack of feed slung over his shoulder. His eyes widened at the sight of the Apache women gathered by the stoop. He lingered too long before sprinting back to town. By noon, men leaned on the rail outside the saloon, smoking and pointing toward the Carver place. Their laughter carried on the dry wind, the kind that cuts deeper than a blade. Elias hitched his horse and rode in for supplies. The store went quiet when he stepped through the door. The storekeeper narrowed his eyes, measuring him like a man weighing spoiled meat. "Word is you've got company," he said flatly. Elias met his stare without flinching. "That's right." Silence stretched, heavy. Then the man turned, scooping flour into a sack, but the set of his shoulders told Elias the gossip had already spread. On his way back, he saw Sheriff Burke riding slow along the ridge, his badge catching the Sunday. The sheriff was a man carved by years of war, patient but stern. He reined in near the gate, his horse stamping dust. "Morning, Elias," Burke said evenly. His gaze shifted to the women standing on the porch. They did not look away, though one clutched the railing for strength. "You know how people here will take it," Burke continued. "Doesn't matter if they're hurt or not. Talk spreads faster than fire, and fire's hard to put out." Elias rested a hand on the top board of the fence. "They haven't broken any law." "Didn't say they had," Burke replied. "But law's only half the fight. Order's the other. If men decide to take it in their own hands, it gets harder to hold." The women listened in silence, their faces unreadable. They had lived under suspicion too long to be surprised. One spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "We came because there was nowhere else to walk. We asked for food, not war." Burke studied her, then looked back to Elias. "She speaks plain. But you should understand, by keeping them, you're choosing a side. Once chosen, there's no turning back." He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode toward town. Dust rose in his wake, settling slow over the yard. Elias stood still, the weight of the warning pressing hard. Behind him, the 5 women remained by the stoop, their shoulders straight despite weariness. They had no words left to offer. He looked at them, then at the empty land stretching wide around the ranch. The choice was already made. The morning sky carried a strange haze, brown and thin, stretching low across the flats. Elias felt it in the weight of the air, in the uneasy creak of the windmill. He had seen it before. Trouble. He walked the fence line with his hammer tucked in his belt. At the stoop, the 5 women watched the sky, their braids whipped by a restless wind. One of them asked softly, "What is coming?" "A dust storm," Elias answered. His voice was steady, but his jaw was tight. "Strong enough to choke cattle, blind a man if he's caught outside. We'll need every latch tight, water set close." He hesitated, then added, "You up for work?" The women exchanged glances, then the eldest stepped forward. "If we cannot work in a storm, we should not be here." Her words carried no bravado, only quiet resolve. Together, they moved quickly. Elias hauled heavy buckets to the corral troughs, while 2 women tied cloth over the tops to keep the grit out. Another climbed onto the porch roof, pressing boards against a loose seam while the younger ones hammered the nails. Sweat and dust stung their eyes, but no one faltered. By midday, the wind roared full. It drove grit into every crack, rattled the boards, and turned the sky to a burning brown. The house shook under the force. Inside, Elias pushed cloth into the seams of the doorframe while the women dampened rags and laid them across the windowsills. Their world shrank to that one room, the stove's dull glow, the sound of nails groaning, and the endless howl outside. They worked until there was nothing left to do but wait. The storm pressed on, hour after hour, dust sifting into their hair and across the floor despite their efforts. They ate a thin stew of beans and sage, coughing between spoonfuls, their throats raw from grit. One of the younger women pressed a rag against her mouth and asked, "How long?" "Could be hours. Could be days," Elias said. He kept his voice calm, though his eyes flicked to the door each time it rattled under the wind's fist. The eldest woman studied him, noting the steadiness of his hands as he tended the stove, the way he checked the windows again and again. She remembered the boy who once laughed by the creek and saw how different he was now, worn, silent, but strong enough to hold ground against the storm. By nightfall, blankets were heavy with dust, and fatigue pressed down like another weight. They did not speak much, but when their eyes met in the lamplight, both Elias and the women knew the truth. Fear was there, yes, but also something stronger: the decision to endure together rather than alone. When dawn broke, the storm finally eased. The land lay half buried, fences leaning, cattle coughing in the yard. Yet the house still stood. They had survived, side by side. The storm had barely settled when the next test came. The air still carried grit, and the fence lines sagged under drifts of dust. Elias and the 5 women spent 2 days digging out the troughs, hauling water, and patching boards shaken loose by the wind. Their hands were raw, their clothes ground stiff with dirt, but the rhythm of work steadied them. For a time, it seemed survival itself might be enough. That illusion broke on the 3rd morning. Elias was repairing a gate hinge when he saw 2 riders coming down the north road. Their horses moved with the tired confidence of animals hardened by long miles. The men wore dusters bleached by sun, wide-brimmed hats pulled low. Their eyes were sharp, the kind that searched without hurry, the kind that found. The women noticed too. They gathered by the stoop, shawls pulled close, their faces pale but unflinching. One whispered a name Elias didn't catch, but the fear in her voice was clear. The riders stopped at the fence. The taller one leaned forward on his saddle horn, his voice carrying across the yard. "We're looking for Apache women," he said. 5 of them. Came this way after a skirmish near the river. Heard they might have made it this far." Elias leaned against the gatepost, his hammer still in hand. "Plenty of travelers pass through," he answered flatly. "I don't keep count." The second rider's gaze slid past him to the house. The women stood visible in the doorway, their shawls tight, their chins lifted. The younger ones trembled, but none stepped back. The rider's lips curled in a smirk. "That them?" he asked, nodding toward the porch. Before Elias could speak, the taller man spat into the dust. "Doesn't matter. We've got bounty notices in Prescott. Apache girls. Scar on one's arm, limp in the other's leg. We'll take 'em and be gone." Elias's body tensed. His first thought was risk what trouble they could bring, how easily his quiet life might collapse. His second thought was memory, the storm, the sound of nails hammered by hands that shook but never quit, the way these women had stood shoulder to shoulder against the wind. He set the hammer down slowly, his voice steady. "No papers, no warrant. You've got nothing here." The second rider scowled. "Since when does a ranch hand speak law? Step aside, cowboy, or we'll drag 'em out ourselves." The moment teetered. Elias's hand hovered close to the revolver on his hip, but he did not draw. He knew if guns cleared leather, blood would soak the yard. And then hoofbeats. Sheriff Burke rode in slow from the ridge, his horse blowing dust from its nostrils. He had seen the men long before they reached the gate. He stopped alongside, one hand resting easy on his reins, the other hanging low near his revolver. "Morning, gentlemen," Burke said, voice even. "You here on county business?" "Private business," the taller man snapped. "Like I said, bounty in Prescott. We'll take the girls and be gone." "Not without papers signed in this county," Burke replied calmly. "And I've seen no warrants, no legal claim. You want to test that? You test me first." The words hung heavy. The riders shifted, their hands brushing too close to their belts. Elias stood unmoving, his jaw tight, every nerve alive. On the porch, the women clutched the railing, ready to resist though they knew the odds. Finally, the taller rider cursed, jerking his reins. "This ain't over. You'll wish you'd thought harder." The two men wheeled their horses and rode off, their silhouettes shrinking against the horizon. Silence lingered when the dust settled. Burke's eyes rested on Elias. You just made yourself part of this, Carver. They'll be back, or others will. You still sure? Elias met his gaze without flinching. I'm sure. The sheriff gave a short nod, tipped his hat, and rode toward town. When Elias turned, the 5 women were still on the stoop. Their shoulders sagged with relief, but their eyes carried something deeper: gratitude mixed with fear, the weight of a bond sealed not by words, but by choice. One stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. You didn't have to. Yes, Elias said quietly. I did. From that day, the line was crossed. They were no longer strangers under his roof. They belonged, and Elias had declared to anyone who would listen that they would not be taken. The ranch had chosen its side. The days after the bounty hunters left were heavy with silence. Elias kept the rifle close to hand, though he never raised it. The women moved through the yard with quiet determination, mending what the storm had broken, hauling water, and cutting wood. Survival had always been their rhythm, and here they carried it into his home without complaint. Elias noticed the changes. The porch, once gray with dust, was swept clean each morning. The troughs stayed filled because the eldest rose before dawn to fetch water. The younger ones patched the roof where grit had driven under the boards, their stitches neat and strong. It wasn't charity they sought, it was belonging. Inside, the cabin no longer felt hollow. One woman stirred beans with herbs she carried in a small pouch. Another scrubbed Elias's shirt and mended the torn seam with careful hands. At night, the air smelled less of smoke and sweat, more of food shared and fire tended. Elias found himself leaving the rifle on its hooks by the door, a habit he hadn't dared since arriving in this valley. He told himself it was practicality, but in truth, he trusted the weight of 6 bodies in the house instead of one. One evening, while they gathered around the table, he spoke more words than he had in weeks. Back quarter, he said, pointing toward the dark soil beyond the corral. Could plant corn there come spring. Maybe beans too. The eldest nodded, her eyes steady. Brush set low for windbreak. We did that south of the river. I can show you. The moment lingered in the lamplight. Elias realized he was no longer talking about patching a life alone. He was speaking of a future, and they answered as if they belonged in it. That night, as the women laid blankets in a corner of the cabin, Elias sat by the fire and let the silence wash over him. It was no longer the silence of emptiness, but of people breathing together after long journeys apart. He knew the town would keep its eyes sharp, that more riders might return, but he also knew he could not imagine the house without them now. When the lamp finally burned low, one of the younger women whispered, as she drifted into sleep, "We will not leave." Elias heard it, though he did not reply. The words were enough. If this story speaks to you, I'd be honored if you subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these Wild West love stories alive, so we can ride together into the next chapter beneath the open skies. The air in town was sharp with suspicion, though no words were spoken outright. Men at the saloon leaned against the rail, their eyes following Elias each time he rode in. Women at the store whispered when the 5 Apache women accompanied him, though some looked longer, curiosity edging out hatred. The uneasy peace held until the day of the well. It was near midday when the cry cut through the square, a sound too raw to be ignored, a mother's scream. Elias dropped the sack of flour from his arms and ran toward the churchyard. Dust rose in clouds as boots pounded the earth, people rushing from every doorway. A boy, no more than 6, had slipped through the rotten cover of the well and fallen into the shaft. His mother clawed at the stones, sobbing, while the pastor shouted for planks and rope. The crowd shouted over itself, voices colliding into panic. The 5 women arrived moments later, pushing through the circle of bodies. The town stiffened at their presence, suspicion flashing in every glance. But one of them dropped to her knees at the well's edge, peering down into the darkness. Her voice cut clean through the noise. "Bring me rope. Strong rope." No one moved at first. Fear tangled with prejudice. The sight of an Apache woman taking command unsettled them. Then Elias's voice rose, sharp as a whip. "Do as she says." Hands scrambled, dragging forward a coil of rope. Elias tied it around her waist. his fingers rough but steady. Their eyes met, a wordless exchange. "You sure?" he murmured. She nodded once. "I've hauled water from pits deeper than this." The crowd fell into a tense silence as Elias braced himself at the wellhead, boots dug into the dirt. The rope squealed against the stones, lowering her into the darkness. The air below was damp and close. Her shoulders scraped the walls as she descended, but she pushed past it, inch by inch. At the bottom, the boy clung to a jagged ledge, his small arms trembling, his face pale with terror. "Hold me," she whispered, steadying his arms around her neck. "Do not let go." Above, Elias shouted, "Pull." The rope tightened, his muscles straining as the crowd surged forward to help. Slowly, inch by inch, the pair rose. The boy's cries echoed up the shaft until his head cleared the stones. Hands grabbed, dragging him onto solid ground. His mother collapsed around him in sobs of relief. The woman emerged last, her hands raw, her ribs burning from the strain. She dragged herself over the edge and sat back on the dirt, chest heaving. For a moment, the square was silent, filled only with the sound of the boys crying. Then a murmur rose, not of hatred, but of awe. The storekeeper's wife stepped forward, pressing a hand to her shoulder. "You saved him," she said softly. The crowd shifted uneasily, their hard opinions dented by what they had witnessed. For the first time, the 5 women were not shadows of old scars, but flesh and blood protectors. Elias stood beside them, dust streaked across his face, and in that silence he knew. The town's eyes had changed. Not enough to call it acceptance, but enough to make survival possible. That evening, as the women sat on the stoop, Elias handed each a cup of water. No words were spoken, but when their eyes met, trust had already begun to root. The day after the well rescue, the air in town carried a different weight. Suspicion still lingered, but it no longer sharpened into open scorn. Instead, when Elias walked into the store, the keeper's wife quietly slid a small sack of coffee onto the counter. "For thanks," she murmured. The storekeeper said nothing, only cleared his throat and wrote the purchase down without remark. The women sensed it too. When they came to town with Elias to carry supplies, no one spat at their feet. A few still turned away, but others simply watched, uncertain. For people who had lived too long under the weight of hatred, even that was a change. Back at the ranch, life pressed forward with steady rhythm. They patched fences, hauled water, and turned the back quarter of soil with a borrowed plow. The women showed Elias how to set brush low for windbreak, just as their people had done by the river. Together they planned where corn might sprout, where beans could twist up poles. What had once been a place of silence began to look like a home. One evening, as dusk painted the yard in gold, Sheriff Burke rode in. His horse snorted dust, hooves slow against the hard ground. He dismounted by the fence and handed Elias a folded packet of papers. "From the county seat," he said simply. Elias opened them by lantern light while the women stood near, their eyes wary. Inside were homestead claims, the kind settlers filed to mark land as their own. But Burke's words carried weight beyond the paper. "If you file these in both names, yours and theirs, it gives them standing. Legal standing. No bounty man can claim they don't belong if you're gone. No drifter can call them trespassers." Elias read in silence, the lamp's glow tracing the lines of his weathered face. For a moment, he felt the old ache of doubt, the fear of making himself a target, of tying his life to people the town might never fully accept. But when he looked at the 5 women gathered close, he saw the same steadiness that had carried them through storm and suspicion. He folded the papers carefully and set them on the table. "Saturday," he said. "We'll ride in. We'll file it together." The women exchanged glances. One whispered, "You would give our names to the county? On your land?" "It's our land if you choose it," Elias replied, his voice flat but certain. The next days carried a different kind of work. They cut posts for new fence corners, tilled the dark ridge soil, and mended clothes with the coarse cotton Elias had bought. But every task seemed to carry an unspoken weight. The knowledge that Saturday would bind them not just to the land, but to each other. At night, the house glowed with lamplight and the smell of sage beans. Elias found himself speaking more freely, pointing out rows that might hold corn, or how the cattle could be moved to fresher grass. The women answered with their own knowledge, showing how to dry herbs for medicine, how to patch walls with clay to keep dust from seeping through. Each word laid a stone in something larger than survival. Saturday came with pale skies and a wind that carried the scent of rain. Elias saddled his horse, and the women climbed onto two others, their shawls pulled tight. They rode together into the county seat, dust rising behind them like a banner. The clerk eyed them curiously as they stepped inside the office. Elias laid the papers on the desk. With a hand that barely trembled, he signed his name. Then, one by one, the women pressed their names beside his. Their letters were careful, some shaky, but each stroke carried the weight of years spent without recognition. The clerk stamped the papers with a sharp thud. Sheriff Burke, standing as witness, gave a short nod. It's done. On the ride home, the folded deed rested in the pouch of the eldest woman. She touched it more than once, not to check if it was still there, but to remind herself it was real. For the first time, she felt the ground beneath her feet belong as much to her as to anyone else. That night, as they ate cornbread and beans by lamplight, the house felt changed. It was no longer Elias's cabin with guests inside. It was a homestead with 6 names on its claim. They weren't just surviving anymore. They belonged. The deed changed everything, though not in ways the town could ignore. Elias had tied his name to the 5 Apache women before the county clerk, and Sheriff Burke himself had signed as witness. It was legal now, undeniable. Yet the law on paper didn't quiet the bitterness of men who drank their evenings away at the saloon and spat when they spoke the word Apache. For a few days, silence held. People glanced but said nothing. A woman at the well even nodded once toward the eldest of the 5 when she passed. But by the week's end, anger hardened again, and it came riding. It was near sundown when Elias heard the horses. 3 of them, hooves slow and deliberate, crunching over dry earth. He stepped out onto the porch, revolver at his hip but not drawn. The women were in the yard, gathering kindling and sweeping dust from the stoop. They stiffened at the sound, setting baskets down with careful hands. The riders came into view, 3 men Elias knew too well from town. The kind who leaned against the saloon rail, mouths full of threats they rarely had the courage to carry out. But tonight their eyes were mean, and one carried a half-empty bottle that swung loosely in his grip. The leader, a broad man with a scar across his cheek, reined in at the fence. His smile was all mockery. "Evening, Carver. Looks like you've made yourself a new arrangement out here." His gaze slid past Elias toward the women. Paper or no paper, folks don't take kindly to Apache women playing homesteader. Elias leaned against the porch post, his arms loose at his sides, but his eyes hard. "You've had your say. Now ride on." The second man laughed, sharp and ugly. "We're not here for talk. We're here to remind you the town don't want them. You turn them out, we're done. You keep them, you're choosing sides you can't hold." His hand brushed the butt of his revolver, slow and deliberate, letting the weight of the gesture hang. The women moved closer to the porch. One set her hands on the gate latch, steady despite the tremor in her ribs. Another gripped the handle of the broom, as if it were a staff. They were not running. Not this time. Elias's jaw tightened. His voice came low, steady as iron. "I've already chosen." The scarred leader sneered. "Then you've chosen wrong." The air thickened. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the creak of saddle leather, the soft rustle of skirts behind Elias as the women braced themselves. His hand hovered inches from the revolver, ready for whatever might break loose. Then a voice cut across the tension. "That's far enough." From the elm beyond the fence, Sheriff Burke stepped into sight, his revolver already in hand, barrel low but steady. He had been watching since dusk, following a hunch that men like these wouldn't let silence last too long. The scarred man turned his horse halfway, his sneer faltering. "Sheriff, this ain't your fight." Burke's jaw tightened. "It's the county's fight if you draw on a man at his own fence. You want to push it? Then I'll bury the first one who does." His tone left no room for doubt. For a long moment, no one moved. The riders shifted uneasily, their bravado wilting under the sheriff's steady aim. Finally, the leader spat into the dust. "This ain't over, Carver. You'll wish you'd thought harder." He jerked his reins, and the 3 horses turned, retreating into the dusk with curses trailing after them. The yard fell quiet. Elias lowered his hand from his revolver, though his eyes stayed fixed on the road long after the riders disappeared. Sheriff Burke holstered his weapon and looked square at Elias. "You've made your choice clear. Don't expect it to get easier." Elias gave a short nod. "Didn't ask for easy." Burke tipped his hat toward the women. "You held steady." Then he turned and rode off, leaving them with the cooling air and the long shadows stretching across the land. Inside, when the lamps were lit, Elias sat at the table cleaning his revolver in silence. The women busied themselves with the evening meal, but one by one, their hands slowed. Finally, the eldest crossed the room and laid her hand over his. Not for comfort, not for thanks, but as a mark of standing with him in the choice he had just confirmed in front of the whole county. He looked at her hand calloused but steady, then at the faces of the others gathered close. No words were spoken, yet in that silence, all six understood. They were no longer surviving side by side. They were bound together now in name, in land, and in defiance of anyone who tried to break them apart. The night after the riders left, the cabin stayed quiet. No one slept deeply. Every creak of wood, every shuffle of the cattle outside, carried the question of whether hoofbeats might come again. But when dawn broke, the yard was still. The corral held, the cattle lowed, and the wind carried nothing but dust across the flats. For the first time in weeks, Elias felt the Aries in his chest. He rose before sunrise as always, but when he stepped outside, 5 figures were already in the yard. The women had swept the porch, gathered kindling, and carried water to the troughs. Their movements were measured, steady, the rhythm of people who understood that life could only be held together by labor. Elias joined them without a word. Together they turned the soil of the back quarter, the dark ridge where rain sometimes lingered longer. The women showed him how to stack brush low along the edge, to hold sand from running under the fence. He listened more closely than he had listened to anyone in years, watching their hands sketch lines in the dirt, marking where beans could climb, where corn might take root. By midday, sweat soaked their clothes, dust clung to their skin, but there was a sense of something new purpose. Not patching what storms had broken, not waiting for trouble to return, but shaping ground into future. That evening, the cabin smelled of herbs and beans. One of the younger women had found wild sage and dried it over the stove, stirring it into the pot. Elias sat at the table, watching as they moved about the small space with quiet efficiency. He realized he had built this place for solitude, but it no longer felt like a hollow shell. Every motion, the sweep of a broom, the sound of laughter faint but real, was changing the walls themselves. The eldest woman laid his mended shirt across the chair, the stitches neat and strong. "It will hold," she said simply. Elias ran a hand across the fabric, feeling the weight of her care in every line. For a man who had spent years patching wounds he never spoke of, the gesture meant more than words. That night, the rifle stayed on its hooks by the door. Elias sat by the fire, listening to the murmur of voices fading into sleep. The silence that filled the room was no longer the silence of loneliness, but of belonging. Days turned to weeks, and the land began to answer their work. The first shoots of corn pushed through the ridge soil. Beans twined up poles cut from scrub brush. The cattle filled out on grass kept clean by troughs the women scrubbed each morning. Elias found himself speaking in ways he hadn't before: talk of fences, of soil, of what could be planted come spring. The women answered with their own knowledge. They showed him how to dry herbs for medicine, how to lay clay against the cracks in the wall so dust storms wouldn't press through as fiercely. They patched the roof with strips of cloth and bark, each repair shaping the cabin into something less fragile, more lived in. One Sunday afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Elias and the 5 women stood by the corral. The cattle pressed against the fence, tails flicking in the cool air. Elias leaned on the post, quiet, then spoke. "When I came here, I built this place to keep others out. Thought silence was safer than losing again, but it doesn't feel empty anymore." The women said nothing, but one of them reached out and set her hand lightly on the rail beside his. Her fingers were rough, cracked from labor, but the gesture was steady, an anchor against the long years of wandering that had brought him here. The wind carried the smell of earth and smoke. For once, Elias didn't think of what the town might say, or whether riders might come again. He thought only of the ground beneath his feet, and the 6 shadows stretching together across the yard. The ranch was no longer his alone. It was theirs. The days after the confrontation passed in uneasy calm. No riders came back. No fresh threats carried across the flats. The town's talk turned to weather and cattle prices, as if trouble had grown tired of itself. For Elias, it wasn't trust, but it was enough. Life on the ranch settled into rhythm. Every morning began with the sound of water buckets clanging, beans simmering on the stove, and the quiet hum of 5 women moving with purpose. Elias rose before sunrise, but he no longer worked alone. Together, they patched fences, hauled water, and tended the cattle. What had once been a cabin of silence now held the sound of life. By midsummer, corn stretched high along the ridge, beans twisted up poles, and cattle filled out strong. The land answered their care, as if recognizing it now belonged not to one man, but to 6 souls bound together by survival and choice. One evening, Pastor Green rode out with Sheriff Burke. He carried a folded paper tucked inside his coat. "I can file your claim not only as homestead," he told Elias, "but as marriage. It will give them standing legal and clear. No one will dare say they don't belong." Elias looked toward the women on the porch. They stood steady, eyes calm but watchful. His answer came without flourish. Yes. The pastor read the vows plain and short under the fading sky, the corral fence behind them, the windmill creaking slow. There were no rings, no music, only names signed on a page, ink pressed steady. Elias Carver's name, and the 5 names of the women who had walked into his life when silence had nearly consumed it. When it was done, the witnesses shared cornbread and coffee, then rode back toward town, leaving the homestead wrapped in dusk. On the stoop, Elias sat with the deed in his lap while the women gathered close. One whispered, "Everywhere we were told we did not belong. Today, the ground says different." Elias nodded, voice low but certain. "This land is yours as much as mine. No one takes that now." The days that followed carried a new steadiness. Work was the same, patching fences, tending cattle, planting rows, but the weight of it had shifted. It was no longer survival alone. It was building something lasting. The town never turned warm, but it turned fair. Some nodded instead of spitting. Others offered greetings without scorn. Small kindnesses, an apple,